Formula One is built on stories that are honestly too brutal for TV. Drivers crushed under pressure, lives changed in a second, champions left bankrupt, families torn apart. And these weren't just PR scandals, they triggered safety rules, lawsuits, and reforms that shaped the sport. You guys think Netflix tells the whole story? Not even close. So let's strip away the gloss. I'm breaking down the 8 moments F1 would rather you forget. The ones that explain why the sport is the way it is today. And it starts with the costliest truth of all. 1. Deaths that changed everything. Imagine realizing that in Formula One, nearly every major safety feature exists because someone never survived long enough to benefit from it. That's the part nobody wants to say out loud. And it's why deaths in F1 aren't just tragedies. They're the turning points that rewrote the rulebook. Take Suzuka 2014. Jules Bianchi lost control in the wet, slid off track, and slammed into a recovery vehicle that should never have been exposed like that. He was only 25. What followed wasn't just mourning, it was the FIA launching a 396-page investigation, pulling apart every detail. The findings were damning. Race timing that ran into low light, dangerous handling of recovery machinery, and a culture of trusting drivers to slow down instead of enforcing strict measures. The result was the virtual safety car, first trialed months later and made law in 2015, plus enforced speed limits in yellow flag zones. Even race start times and calendar planning were overhauled, all because one young driver's accident showed how fragile the system really was. And if you think that was an isolated case, rewind to Imola 1994. In one weekend, 2 drivers died, Roland Ratzenberger during qualifying and Ayrton Senna the very next day. Senna was already the sport's biggest icon, a 3-time world champion seen as untouchable behind the wheel. But his death forced F1 into a reckoning. Circuits were redesigned with more runoff areas, safety barriers were upgraded, cockpit protection was improved, and car structures became more robust. The so-called era of high-tech, safest ever racing had just produced its darkest chapter, and only then did officials respond. Netflix doesn't flat out erase Imola, but it strips the detail, packaging it as a tragic weekend rather than the catalyst for sweeping reforms it really was. Across both Bianchi in 2014 and Senna and Ratzenberger in 1994, you see the same brutal pattern. Changes only arrived after funerals. Bianchi's crash brought in the virtual safety car and stricter flag rules. Senna and Ratzenberger's deaths led to whole circuit layouts being rewritten and cars evolving into safer machines. Safety in F1 wasn't dreamed up by committees in advance. It was wrestled from disaster, sometimes multiple disasters in the same season. That's the harsh truth. Every barrier, flag rule, or medical advance in F1 carries someone's name in the background, even if fans today don't realize it. The glamour shots of podiums hide the fact that entire careers and lives were sacrificed to earn each incremental improvement. And while modern drivers are shielded at 200 miles an hour in ways Senna couldn't have imagined, there's still no barrier for the other battles they face. Because not all the danger comes at the track edge. Some of the hardest fights for drivers happen silently, when the helmet comes off. 2. Mental health behind glamour. People think being an F1 driver means living in a palace with supercars parked outside. But mental health doesn't care how many titles you've won. The pressure inside this sport has broken some of the biggest names on the grid, and Lewis Hamilton is the clearest example. Netflix paints him as a flawless superstar, always confident, always polished. The reality is different. Hamilton has said he's battled depression since he was 13, shaped by racism and bullying growing up in Stevenage, and later by being the only black driver carrying racing's diversity debate on his shoulders. That's not glamour. That's a burden. Even after becoming a 7-time world champion, the weight didn't go away. Look at Abu Dhabi 2021. He lost the championship in one of the most controversial races ever, and instead of showing anger, he disappeared. No interviews, no social media, nothing for weeks. That silence was a louder statement than any soundbite. His decision to open up later about his struggles wasn't weakness. It was one of the rare times F1's walls of bravado cracked, and it made other drivers more comfortable admitting their own battles. And it's not just veterans. The pandemic years shoved every driver under a microscope. Instead of jet setting, they were trapped in hotel rooms and team bubbles, with entire seasons dissected by bored fans stuck at home. One bad quali run, one TikTok, or even what you ate became headlines, and that eats away fast. For rookies, it was brutal. Lando Norris admitted he hit depression in his first season with McLaren, even as he looked like the happiest kid living the dream. He was 19 years old, barely out of high school, suddenly piloting a Formula One car with millions of strangers online calling him useless. Norris said he relied heavily on McLaren's support system to manage those early seasons. Without it, who knows how it would have gone. That honesty helped show that even the smiley guy of F1 wasn't immune, and it pushed fans to see drivers as people instead of machines for entertainment. This is what fans miss when the cameras sanitize everything. These guys can trade overtakes at 200 miles an hour, yet lie awake at night replaying every mistake, unable to silence the noise. The constant anxiety, the sleepless nights, the self-doubt. It chips away until performance itself drops. What outsiders might dismiss as weakness is often the breaking point between surviving in the sport or spiraling out. And this pressure doesn't just crush confidence, it ends careers. Because sometimes it's not just the mental strain that pushes a driver to the edge. There are brutal moments when a career that feels untouchable gets ripped apart in seconds by something far more physical. 3. Career-ending crashes. Some Formula One careers don't end with farewell press conferences and celebration tours. They stop instantly, with metal, fire, or something completely out of anyone's control. Save his life. For a driver who had already been a race winner and tipped as a potential world champion, it was devastating. Rehabilitation took years, and the permanent loss of strength in his hand meant many assumed he'd never race again. Yet in 2019, 8 years later, Kubica lined up for Williams. The car was painfully slow, but he still scored a point at the German Grand Prix, a result that for him mattered more than any podium because it proved he refused to let the crash close his story. Now look at Felipe Massa in 2009, and you realize how random and brutal F1 can be. During qualifying for the Hungarian Grand Prix on 25 July, a suspension spring flew off Rubens Barrichello's car ahead of him, launching through the air at nearly 162 miles per hour. It hit Massa directly in the helmet, causing a skull fracture and knocking him unconscious instantly. He crashed straight into the barriers with his foot still on the throttle. Massa was put into an induced coma for 2 days, and surgeons had to insert a titanium plate in his skull. The fact he returned to the grid in 2010 was unbelievable, but it's obvious that the razor-sharp version of Massa, who challenged Hamilton for the 2008 championship, never fully returned. His courage was unquestionable, but the accident robbed him of the tiny margins that decide races at the top. And then there's Niki Lauda, Nürburgring, 1976, the most infamous crash survival story of all. His Ferrari hit the barriers and burst into flames, trapping him in the wreck as toxic fumes filled his lungs. Other drivers ran over to pull him out, but by then his face and scalp were severely burned, and his lungs were so badly damaged that priests read him last rites in hospital. Yet 6 weeks later, he turned up at Monza, his head still bandaged, with burned skin raw under his helmet. He finished 4th in the race. Lauda admitted he was afraid, that every bump in the car triggered flashbacks, but he forced himself through it. His return wasn't about glory. It was about taking control back from the accident that nearly killed him. Kubica, Massa, Lauda, 3 different crashes, 3 different eras, all linked by the same brutal reality. Survival in this sport usually means change follows. Stronger helmets after Massa, faster medical response after Lauda, and safety debates over off-season rallying after Kubica. Every shattered body forced Formula One to adjust its rules. And as much as crashes rewrote careers, some drivers didn't need a circuit to ruin theirs. Sometimes all it took was one mistake away from the track. 4. Criminal convictions. Criminal convictions don't usually show up in highlight reels, but in Formula One, they've ended careers just as brutally as any crash. Bertrand Gachot is the classic example. In December 1990, after a minor road dispute in London, he sprayed a taxi driver with CS gas. By the time the court case wrapped in August 1991, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison, though he ended up serving just 2. The timing could not have been worse. Gauchot had been Jordan's full-time driver that season and had even won the 24 Hours of Le Mans that year. Suddenly, instead of lining up on the grid at Spa for the Belgian Grand Prix, he was in a cell. Eddie Jordan needed a replacement at the last minute, and in walked a 22-year-old German rookie backed by Mercedes, Michael Schumacher. Schumacher stunned the paddock in qualifying, and everyone knows the legacy that followed: 7 world titles. Gauchot, meanwhile, became the guy remembered more for going to jail than for his race pace. His career didn't just stall, it got hijacked by history. 2 decades later, Adrian Sutil managed to blow up his own future in another life-altering mistake. On April 17, 2011, after the Chinese Grand Prix, he was celebrating at a Shanghai nightclub when an argument with Renault F1 executive Eric Lux turned violent. Sutil struck Lux with a champagne glass, cutting his neck so badly it needed around 24 stitches. What followed was a long legal battle. In January 2012, a Munich court convicted Sutil of causing grievous bodily harm. He was handed an 18-month suspended sentence and fined a huge sum, over 200,000 euros, which was directed to charity. The facts didn't just stain his reputation, they tanked his career. By the following season, Force India replaced him with Nico Hülkenberg, and while Sutil did return later, the momentum was gone. In a sport where deals hinge on image as much as skill, being the driver who turned a party into a courtroom drama meant doors stopped opening. Sponsors don't forget, and teams always have alternatives. One night, one punch, and the season lights out. What kind of pressure makes grown athletes behave like this? And then there's Jean Alesi, a different kind of story but still tangled with the law. In 2021, long after his Ferrari days, Alesi admitted to firing a large firework into an office window owned by his brother-in-law. He described it as a bad joke, part of a family tradition of using fireworks during celebrations. The explosion caused property damage and landed Alesi, along with his son Giuliano, in court. Ultimately, both were acquitted. The judge ruled there was no intent to damage. That outcome meant his legacy didn't suffer the way Gauchot's or Sutil's did, but it still shows how fast a stupid decision can put even famous names in headlines for all the wrong reasons. From Gauchot to Sutil to Alesi, the pattern is clear. F1 drivers aren't just judged by the stopwatch. Courts, cops, and judges have just as much power to define their careers. And once you see how easily off-track decisions derail legacies, it makes you wonder what happens when the trouble isn't with strangers or executives, but with the people closest to them. 5. Family demons. Family demons can be just as relentless as rivalries on the track, and few examples in Formula One make that clearer than the Verstappens. Max may be the superstar of modern F1, but his dad, Jos, has remained an unavoidable part of the story. Jos wasn't just a former driver. He carried a reputation built on controversy, arrests, and aggression that shadowed his son's rise. During his own F1 career in the 90s, he was called Jos the Boss. But once he stepped out of the cockpit, headlines followed him for all the wrong reasons. In 1998, Jos and his father were involved in a violent altercation at a karting track in Belgium that left a man with a fractured skull. 2 years later, a court convicted them, though both received suspended sentences after financial settlement. Then, in 2008, Jos was convicted of assaulting his ex-wife, Sophie, Max's mother, and fined, again receiving a suspended sentence. In 2012, he was even jailed briefly on attempted murder charges after allegedly trying to run over another ex-partner, Kelly Van de Waal, with his car. Those charges were dropped due to lack of evidence, but his reputation as a hothead was cemented. These weren't minor incidents. They were widely reported, dragged into court, and all took place during the years Jos was managing young Max's karting career. Combine that background with a strict, sometimes ruthless parenting style, and you get the upbringing that has always divided fans. Stories from Max's karting days are brutal. Jos screaming at him in the paddock after lost heats, leaving him behind at tracks to drive lessons home. To outsiders, it looks extreme, but Jos argued it demanded excellence at all times, and it's impossible to deny the results. Max emerged from that system with a competitive edge sharper than almost anyone on the grid. The debate is whether that relentlessness was simply natural genius, or also something forged by pressure, fear, and a father willing to sacrifice everything for results. That's where the tension sits. No one doubts Max's talent. His racecraft, overtakes, and ability to squeeze performance from any car are his own. But the environment he grew up in can't just be erased. Sponsors and broadcasters market him as the unstoppable champion while carefully sidestepping the messier truth of his father's history. Fans don't forget it, though. Look at any F1 forum and you'll see Jos' name dragged into debates about Max's personality and aggression. The family history lurks in the background, even as Max dominates the sport at record pace. Family baggage doesn't vanish when the trophies pile up. It rides along in every victory shot, whether the cameras acknowledge it or not. And when it comes to darker legacies inside Formula One, the Verstappens aren't alone. Because in earlier eras, the demons weren't always family. They were chemical. 6. Substance abuse. F1 in the 1970s wasn't just chaos on the racetrack, it was chaos off it too. Drivers were treated like celebrities, and plenty of them leaned into living exactly like that. Fast cars mixed with late nights, endless parties, and a culture that cheered excess. No one embodied that more than James Hunt, the 1976 Formula One world champion. Tall, blonde, and wandering through the paddock in an open shirt with a cigarette in one hand and a drink in the other, Hunt became the face of an era that sold rebellion as glamour. Cameras adored him, fans couldn't get enough, and headlines followed him everywhere. But behind the rock star act was a life powered by heavy drinking, cocaine, chain smoking, and every distraction fame could buy. A lifestyle that would later kill him at just 45 years old when he suffered a heart attack on the 15th of June 1993. What people saw at the time was only the highlight reel. Champagne celebrations, wild nights, Hunt showing up to the grid after drinking. It was all packaged as comedy. A Netflix-style recap today would frame him as some lovable rogue. The truth is, he was living with addiction. His habits weren't quirks. They were destructive dependencies that ate away at his body long before that heart finally gave out. His death wasn't a legendary curtain call for a wild racer. It was a man's health collapsing after years of abuse, while the world mistook misery for charisma. To understand Hunt, you need to understand the culture that pushed him. The 1970s glorified danger. On track, drivers strapped themselves into machines that were far from safe, and off track they sold the same image: reckless, larger-than-life figures doing what others wouldn't dare. Teams, sponsors, even broadcasters played along. Being a drinker, a smoker, a hard liver wasn't a liability. It was seen as a brand. Hunt wasn't hiding his excess. He was monetizing it. Every cigarette ad, every newspaper spread reinforced the idea that this was part of the show. It hid the fact that for the drivers themselves, those habits came with a cost. Hunt's public swagger masked something more fragile underneath. He was insecure, overwhelmed by the pressure, and more fragile than fans realized. Racing terrified him at times, and when the spotlight treated him like a celebrity caricature, it pushed his habits deeper. After retiring in 1979, things only worsened. Without the structure of racing, the binging intensified, his finances dried up, and his health cratered. Did you know by the end he was driving around in an old Austin A35 van because his fortune had collapsed? That detail says everything about how far things spiraled. The man remembered for world titles and parties was quietly unraveling behind closed doors. The real tragedy of Hunt is that people thought they were celebrating freedom and rebellion when, in reality, they were watching him self-destruct in slow motion. The glamour masked the damage. And it wasn't just Hunt. Drivers in F1 didn't just lose their health to excess, they often lost their fortunes too. 7. Financial ruin. Money wrecks drivers in ways the cameras never show. Financial ruin has swallowed world champions whole, and the sport doesn't slow down to notice. Take Alain Prost. After retiring as a 4-time world champion, he wasn't content to just sit on past glory. He wanted to build something bigger. His vision was Prost Grand Prix, a fully French Formula One team with French drivers, engineers, and sponsors. Prost bought Ligier in 1997 and transformed it under his own name. On paper, it was patriotic and ambitious. In reality, it was a ticking clock of debt. By January 2002, the Versailles Commercial Court ordered the team's liquidation with estimated debts of around $28 million. Think about that. One of the most successful drivers in history watching a courtroom sign off on the death of his dream. Prost called it a total failure for France. Sponsors pulled out, backers disappeared, and even the French investors he counted on were the last to quit. The final sting? Renault announced its big return to Formula One the very next day, leaving Prost humiliated on the sidelines as another national team rolled out under fresh banners. If you thought titles buy you peace, Prost's spreadsheet says otherwise. And this wasn't a one-off. Even champions outside the team owner bubble felt the squeeze. Alan Jones, the 1980 world champion, worked his way into F1 the hard way, scraping by with odd jobs in Europe before breaking through. But 2 decades after his title, in 2001, he auctioned off his championship trophy and memorabilia at Christie's in Melbourne. Not as a press stunt, not for charity. When a champion parts with the ultimate symbol of his career, it raises eyebrows and suggests serious financial strain. The trophy itself, designed as a stylized wheel with a laurel and flag, was supposed to sit in his home forever. Yet there it was, under the hammer. 8. Survivors. Some drivers didn't just survive crashes, they grew into entirely different lives that mattered far more than podiums or points. Clay Regazzoni shows exactly what that looks like. At the 1980 United States Grand Prix West in Long Beach, his ensign suffered brake failure at nearly 280 kilometers per hour. He shot straight into a parked car before smashing a concrete barrier. The impact shattered his spine and left him paralyzed from the waist down. 1 second he was an experienced Ferrari race winner. The next his Formula One career was over. No comeback drives in F1, no glittering farewell. Just a sudden, brutal stop. But Regazzoni never let that accident be the final word. Instead of retreating, he reinvented himself. He became an outspoken advocate for people with disabilities in Italy and across Europe, pushing for accessibility long before it was a mainstream subject in sport. He traveled, gave talks, and used his platform to raise awareness with a determination as fierce as any Grand Prix fight. And the racing spirit never left him. Regazzoni strapped into hand-controlled cars, proving he still had the instinct to compete even if his body was working on different terms. That passion challenged the image of disability at the time, showing that losing your legs didn't mean losing your identity. This wasn't the kind of narrative the sport liked to showcase. There were no champagne celebrations, no rain-soaked glory moments, no slow-motion replays of daring overtakes. Regazzoni's story was about showing kids in wheelchairs that their lives weren't finished, about convincing venues to put in ramps, about simply proving that resilience could carry as much weight as raw speed. The highlight reel world skipped it because it didn't fit the glamour. But what he represented carried more meaning than most race wins ever could. His legacy is a reminder that survival in Formula One isn't glitter and parades. It's waking up after an accident and deciding to fight for a life that looks nothing like the one you expected. For Regazzoni, the impact reached even beyond motorsport fans. He inspired people who had never watched a race in their lives. His influence as a survivor eclipsed his time as a Ferrari driver. He became living proof that a devastating crash wasn't an ending, but a brutal beginning to something different and just as important. If Regazzoni's second act surprised you, drop a comment about which survivor story hit you hardest. Because moments like his show us a truth the sport doesn't like to advertise. The real impact of Formula One is measured not just in wins or titles, but in scars, strength, and the way people rebuild after everything breaks. And once you see that, it changes how you look at every safety barrier, every new rule, every helmet. None of it came for free. Formula One doesn't just write legends on track. It writes them in courtrooms, in rehab wards, in the silence after funerals. Many safety features we take for granted. The virtual safety car, enforced flag rules, tougher cockpits, only exist because tragedies rip the sport open. Bianchi at Suzuka. Senna, and Ratzenberger at Imola. Kubica, Massa, Lauda all forced F1 to confront medical response and survival. Off-track, drivers like Hamilton, Norris, and even Gachot reminded fans they're human beings, not machines in helmets. So what do you think? What's the most surprising F1 truth you never knew? Drop it in the comments and subscribe if you want the stories Netflix won't touch. Because if you only watch the champagne, you miss the cost of the check.